Slightly different wording of the question here, but it's still the same premise we've seen in other support and weakened questions. Which quotation from an art critic most directly challenges the underlying claim of the text? So that's weaken, right? They're trying to weaken the claim. So read the whole passage, focus on the underline, then summarize it, and then flip the summary. A member of the Otomi, an indigenous people in central Mexico, Octavio Medellin immigrated to the United States as a child, and his sculpture bears the impress of traditions of both sides of the border. U.S.-based modernist sculpture, Mexican modernist painting, Otomi art, and the ancient sculpture of other Mexican indigenous peoples, including the Maya. Wow, that's quite the sentence. Focus on the underline. In his 1950 masterpiece, History of Mexico, Medellin fuses, that's a strong word, these influences into a style so idiosyncratic that it resists efforts to view his work through the lens of nationality or cultural identity. Artists, he insisted, should strive for individual expression, even as they draw inspiration from their heritage and the communities where they live and work. So the idea of fusing something, right, things being brought together, that's important. Hopefully you know the word fuses. That is not a hard word. You need to definitely know that for the SAT and just the English language. Now, idiosyncratic is a different story. So I would not blame you for not knowing that word. But we have lots of clues here, right? We talk about it resists efforts to kind of have an identity. Right? You strive for individual expression, right? So there's things about like idiosyncratic kind of being about individuality and being kind of hard to identify. And that's basically what it means. I would say idiosyncratic, the best to me word is just like quirky, or just like weird. You called a person idiosyncratic. You're calling them weird, but not in necessarily a bad way. They're just quirky. They've got their own little thing going on, and yeah. And so here, that's kind of what we're saying, right? It's that person who's idiosyncratic would be hard to categorize, right? They're in like a John Hughes like high school movie. They're not the jocks. They're not the nerds. They're not the goths. Whatever. They're their own thing, right? They're idiosyncratic. They're their own category, maybe. So we want to weaken that, right? So let's not lose sight of that, right? So this is all talking about individual expression. So we want to challenge this. So we want to say it's not quirky or it's not individual, right? There's something common about it, right? Let's see if we get any choices about that. A, although a number of ancient indigenous artistic traditions pictured human forms in profile, the forms populating the surface of a history of Mexico suggest a specifically Maya influence. Is that, if it's Maya, does that mean that it's, I don't know, does that mean that it's different or that it's kind of identifiable, right? I mean, he says it resists efforts to view his work through the lens of nationality or cultural identity. If we can say that it's a Maya influence, that sounds like it's weakening it. I don't know. Let's move on. Let's look at B. In History of Mexico, the synthesis of ancient and modernist traditions functions as a stylistic parallel to the work's subject matter, a survey of centuries of Mexican history. Well, synthesis is an important word to know. That basically means a fusion, a combination of ancient and modernist traditions. So if this is fusing things, then that's exactly what the underlying portion said, right? He fuses these influences. So that doesn't seem like it's weakening it. That seems like it's supporting it. So that we can get rid of pretty confidently. C, many critics focus on indigenous influences in A History of Mexico and other key works by Medellin to the exclusion of influences from non-indigenous art. Okay, do I really hear what they focus on? I mean, again, if it's multiple influences and we're identifying them, I don't know. Does this mean that they're being fused together and we're just choosing to ignore some versus others? I genuinely don't even know what this is saying. Let's look at D. While History of Mexico features modernist motifs, it relies primarily on angular human forms and profile, a staple of Maya sculpture, and thus invites classification as indigenous art. Okay, well, right, it relies primarily on one thing. Right. So if it's supposed to resist the effort to think of it as a nationality or a cultural identity, and it's a staple of Maya sculpture, and it invites classification as indigenous art, it sounds like we're saying that we can classify it as an identity. So at this point, I'm really leaning towards A or D. So I'm gonna get rid of C. I mostly just don't understand how this relates to it. if this were me during a test, I would be thinking it's probably D, but I'm not letting go of A. A is tricky for me. I feel like it still kind of says the right thing, but let's look at it again. Although a number of ancient indigenous artistic traditions pictured human forms in profile, the forms populating the surface of a history of Mexico suggest a specifically Maya influence. That sounds like we're giving it a specific cultural identity. Where D is saying it's a staple of Maya sculpture. That, to me, that's kind of the same thing. My big issue with A, or it's not even a big issue, if I have to compare A and D, as with any time that I'm stuck between two choices, my thought process is always clear. I want to make the fewest moves possible to connect the choice that I want to pick to the passage. Right now, this is complicated by the fact that here we have to weaken the passage, right? So we need to connect it to the passage while at the same time realizing that we're trying to say the opposite of what the passage is saying. So what the passage is saying is it resists efforts to view his work with a nationality or cultural identity, right? So if we get a choice that says it has a nationality or cultural identity, that's the answer. Now, A says it has a Maya influence, so maybe that's a specific cultural identity. But notice that D just kind of says we can classify it as indigenous art, right? It just comes out and says the word classification, right? And we are trying to fight against this idea that his work is idiosyncratic, that it cannot be classified, that it is too weird to fit in a category. And the fact that choice D just comes out and says it is classified as indigenous art, that seems like the most direct way to contradict what's in the passage, to challenge what's in the passage. I feel like A still kind of fits. Give me your comments on this, though. What am I missing? Is there something about A that feels more wrong? I'm really struggling to find it, but the answer is D. For me, this would be a case where I probably on the test would try to mark a question for review, mostly because maybe I still feel like I'm missing something. Like there must be something more wrong with A. I don't like that my reason for picking D is that it's just more right. That is not usually how questions on the SAT work. It is usually the case that one answer is provably correct and the other three are provably incorrect. There is something wrong with them. I am having trouble finding the thing that is wrong with A. Maybe because it's talking about other ancient indigenous artistic traditions. I don't know. Maybe this is more because it's about motifs, which are like themes. I genuinely don't know. My only other thing I can think of here before I let you guys go is it says, say, a number of ancient indigenous artistic traditions pictured human forms in profile. So maybe that is a fusing of influences. Whereas D just comes out and says, nope, it's not a fusing of anything. It's just the Maya one. I don't know. That's kind of what A says too, though. But maybe it's because they're specifically talking about the forms in the painting or whatever it is. Whereas D is talking about the entire artwork. I don't know. What do you think? Give me your comments. What am I missing? But D is the answer. And I would be pretty confident picking it. I would go back to it if I had more time. But, sometimes on the SAT, you got to place a bet. And D is more direct. So that's the smart bet.